remember the law of my servant Moses, the statutes and rules that I commanded him at Horeb for all Israel. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers.
But since this admonition, 400 years of chaos, destruction, and violence will pass over humanity. God would not speak because humanity would not listen. Until one day, when God's voice was heard again in the womb of a woman. For it was this baby who would be Elijah, meaning Yahweh is my God, preparing the way for Elisha, meaning God is my salvation. For you see, this woman's name was Elizabeth, the God who swears an oath. Her husband's name was Zechariah, meaning the God who remembers. Because you see, the God who promises will always be the God who remembers. This is their story. Let's explore. Our story begins in the days of Herod the Great, when a group of Levitical priests in the small town of Hebron are gathered for a yearly ritual. It was a ceremony that began during the reign of King David. David knew two things. The first was that God would not dwell in a tent forever. Therefore, David wanted to build God a grand temple. But the second thing David knew was that David would not be given the honor of building a proper temple. So David made every preparation possible to make sure his sons would be successful at the task. One preparation David made was appointing new orders of priests to maintain what would be a much larger facility of worship, which meant that not only would the sons of Aaron be priests, but all Levites would be given the opportunity to serve in the temple. The order of Abijah, like many of the other divisions of the Levites, would decide this honorable task by lot, or a cast of the die. And so we find ourselves in Hebron around 4 or 5 BC, where a man by the name of Zechariah is chosen to serve God in this way. In fact, he is chosen to burn incense on the altar in the Temple of Jerusalem, a symbol that throughout Jewish history has served as a sign of the prayers of God's people that rise to the throne of the Most High King. Twice a day, Zechariah was to enter the holy place of the temple. Before the temple veil stood a small wooden table overlaid with gold. He would light incense on the table while a host of Jewish people would pray fervently outside of the holy space. Zechariah would return from the place and close the congregation in a final prayer. As it turns out, Zechariah needed to beseech the king himself. He must have had some tough questions for the God of his fathers, as did Elizabeth, his wife. A woman of priestly descent, her father was likely a Levitical priest as well, whom Zechariah would have married to maintain their priestly lineages. This was another reason in a long line of reasons that Zechariah and Elizabeth would be considered holy, blameless, according to the law of Moses. But while Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth were blameless before the eyes of the Lord, keeping the law of Moses fervently, Elizabeth could not bear any children. She was barren. Like the great women of Israel history, Sarai, Rebekah, Rachel, signs of the covenant curse that God bestowed upon the earth in the garden that was in Eden. It was in this way that Zechariah and Elizabeth traveled from Hebron to Jerusalem with a single-minded task: pray to the God of Israel. And so it was that at the hour of incense, the whole assembly of the people was praying outside, when suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared to Zechariah, standing to the right of the altar of incense. When Zechariah saw him, he was terrified and became overcome with fear. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, because your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you will name him John. There will be joy and delight for you, and many will rejoice at his birth. He will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the disobedient to the understanding of the righteous, to make ready for the Lord a people prepared. Stunned into silence, Zechariah could only manage to squeak out disbelief. "How can I know this?" Zechariah asked the angel. "For I'm an old man, and my wife is well along in years." Well, the angel answered him, "Well, I am Gabriel, who stands in the presence of God, and I was sent to speak to you and to tell you this good news. Now listen. You will become silent and unable to speak until the day these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their proper time." And when the angel of the Lord left, Zechariah was stuck, stunned, and speechless before the altar of incense that continued to rise before him. No doubt the people of God were waiting eagerly outside, feigning words to raise up in prayer as Zechariah took longer and longer to close their ceremony. When he finally returned outside, unable to speak, the people were amazed, assuming that he had seen a vision in the holy place. After his service in the temple ended, Zechariah and Elizabeth returned back to their hometown in Hebron. Elizabeth became pregnant, and she remained quiet for the first 5 months of her pregnancy. Because barrenness, you see, was associated with the curse of Eden in ancient culture. There was a great deal of shame that went right along with it. The thinking would have gone, because Elizabeth cannot have children, there must then be some hideous sin in her life or her family's life. The truth of the matter is the opposite, however. You see, when God seems quiet and distant, he is often most powerfully at work, fulfilling his promises. And so, in the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, when a young Mary shows up, we can only imagine the euphoria that runs through the mind of Elizabeth, who believes that by her pregnant body, her disgrace has been taken away. Mary entered Zechariah's house and greeted Elizabeth. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the baby leapt inside her, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. And then she exclaimed with a loud cry, "Blessed are you
among women, and your child will be blessed. How could this happen to me, that the mother of my Lord should come to me? For you see, when the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the baby leapt for joy inside me. Blessed is she who has believed that the Lord would fulfill what he has spoken to her."
Now, the time had come for Elizabeth to give birth, and she had a son. And then her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown this great mercy to her, and they rejoiced with her. And when they came to circumcise the child on the 8th day, they were going to name him Zechariah after his father, but his mother responded, No, he will be called John. Well, then they said to her, "None of your relatives has that name." So they motioned to his father to find out what he wanted him to be called. And he asked for a writing tablet, and he wrote, "His name is John." And they were all amazed. Immediately, his mouth was opened and his tongue set free, and he began to speak, praising God. Fear came on all those who lived around them, and all these things were talked about throughout the hill country of Judea. All who heard about him took it to heart, saying, "What then will this child become? For indeed the Lord's hand was with him." Well, there's not much left to say about Zechariah and Elizabeth after the opening chapters of Luke, but their story is a story of us. It is a story of hope in a dark world. And some of us are facing that darkness right now today. Some of us are facing the dark, cold, wintry night of doubt, of fear, of pain, of loss, much like Elizabeth and Zechariah were as well. The darkness of the world can often feel like an ever-present reality that is this inescapable burden, like not being able to bear children into your old age. But enter Elizabeth and Zechariah, a story that is perfectly summarized in the song that Zechariah sings at the end of Luke's chapter, a beautiful song of deliverance. You see, Zechariah says, "Blessed is the Lord, the God of Israel, because he has visited and provided redemption for his people. He has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David, just as he spoke by the mouth of his holy prophets in ancient times. Salvation from our enemies and from the hand of those who hate us. He has dealt mercifully with our ancestors and remembered his holy covenant, the oath that he swore to our father Abraham. He has given us the privilege, since we have been rescued from the hand of our enemies, to serve him without fear, in holiness and righteousness in his presence all our days. And you, child, will be called a prophet of the Most High, for you will go before the Lord to prepare his ways, speaking of John the Baptist, to give his people knowledge of salvation through the forgiveness of their sins, because of our God's merciful compassion. The dawn from on high will visit us to shine on those who live in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the way of peace. See, the Israelite people must have felt as though God had forgotten about them, that God was quiet and far off. After all, for 400 years, God had remained practically silent among them. Have you ever felt that way? I have. Maybe only once or twice, really felt that God was silent in my life. But it raised this big, giant question in my head. Does the God of the Bible forget what he's promised? Does he give up? Has he given up on me? He had promised that the ancestors of Abraham would inherit the whole earth, that the offspring of David would be this everlasting king over an everlasting kingdom. And if this God was as good as he claimed to be, as good as he presented himself to be, then a hope in a good, an everlasting kingdom was an essential hope to carry on and move forward. But what if God was quiet? What if it was dark? This is why I believe that the Hebrew Aramaic speaking people who would have read Luke's gospel in the first century, well, I just think they would have grinned at the opening characters, Zechariah and Elizabeth. See, woven into the very fabric of their reality are names that sing a resounding no. This is a God who remembers his promises and fulfills them, even when all seems lost. Which is why we look to these characters in the season of Advent, because the winter season represents to us the very nature of what Elizabeth and Zechariah were experiencing, what the whole world was experiencing. And in many ways, what the whole world is still experiencing to this day as we wait for this kingdom to come here on earth, God's kingdom. This is precisely what Saint Bernard of Clairvaux called the other coming of Jesus Christ. You see, he said, our Lord's first coming is in his flesh and in his weakness. His last coming will be in glory and majesty, and all flesh shall see the salvation of our God. But, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux says, another coming is hidden as souls see within themselves, receive rest and consolation, and are saved. You see, it's his first coming that we celebrate during the season of Advent, but it's this middle coming of Jesus that's a spiritual revelation of his light into the darkness of the world that we rest in. Because oftentimes we face these real, tangible moments of chaos and darkness, these real winters, and Jesus' light shines on our souls and melts away the snow and asks us to rest in his forgiveness now and today. Are we ready to receive him into our homes and into our hearts and rest in that reality during this season? This is Bible and Down. We'll see you next time.